acting.
So what were some of the challenges you and your team encountered during the project, and how are those challenges overcome?
Now, being basically a Girl Scout, if something was top secret, it's top secret, the confidentiality. So I took that very seriously. I also took very seriously the concept that the voice could be the last thing someone hears. So the emotional quality of the call-outs, plus matching pitch parameters for duplication and making sure everything synced up properly. We took that very, very seriously. And we also took it very seriously that we do not tell anyone what we say, because that would also put our pilots in jeopardy, or our astronauts in jeopardy. Continuing on with my career, trying to hit on all bases of voice acting, film acting, theater acting, whatever would fire at any point to keep me a working actor. I could not tell anyone that I was Bitchin' Betty. I could not use it as a credit. First of all, no one knew what a digitized voice was anyway. We were still in the analog concepts, recording reel to reel.
Oh.
We would record in several studios around Huntsville and Muscle Shoals. And the Muscle Shoals studio was phenomenal. I mean, there'd be peanut shells on the floor, and these guys had what I call dog ears. They could cut tape cleaner than we can edit digitally. I mean, they were just the best at what they did. And I remember Bitchin' Betty's vocabulary would change according to military tactics. There would be new things that the plane and the pilots were trained to do. For example, after the Falklands, new maneuvers. So we'd go in and do pickups. Or if we were rolling out a new aircraft, there would be new aircraft capabilities that would require commands. One time going in for a pickup, Barbra Streisand had just left the studio. She had been down there cutting every note of an album just perfectly. So we were kind of like doing this secret mission to A, help get to Mars and help human civilization as we know it, and B, keep our pilots safe and our country safe. There are several times when that has a certain gravitas, kind of blows through your heart. During military campaigns, and if we lose a plane or a space shuttle, you know you've done the best you can to keep everyone safe, but
Of course, right.
it's out of your control. But I feel, and I'm sure Leslie Shook does as well.
Right.
Who took over when McDonnell Douglas, MacDac, and Martin Marietta, they kind of were bought out by Boeing, and new generations of planes were coming in, and they couldn't upgrade the technology of those voice tapes. I believe you told me that in Leslie's interview that she would listen to tapes of how I did the call-outs.
Right.
That sounds about right. The parameters had already been, the T's had been crossed, the I's had been dotted. In a stage role, actors always look up who did it first and see if they, how they discover for a present performance. It would give us our own ideas, but we could in essence replicate someone else doing a role. It's always about the work. There's nothing involved with the ego.
Right.
It's always about the work and making sure the pilots, the heads up, do something. It's always about the work. I was thrilled that even without knowing what was going on with being Bitchin' Betty and how that was evolving out, that I could be of assistance to her. I'm glad. I'm very glad, because it's good work. Back to the original project and the challenges involved with that. The thing that I think surprised me the most, I wasn't surprised by the intensity of the work.
Right.
Because as a professional actor, I had a lot of endurance. I was used to working very hard, very concentrated for hours and hours. What surprised me, so being on mic for all that time, knowing that through the grace of God, the mic was always friendly to me, which is simply a gift.
Yeah, that is.
What surprised me was having to hit certain pitches. There are certain frequencies of the sine wave, like light is a wave, so is sound. I remember my dad, the rocket engineer, saying, okay, let's go outside, and we have a flashlight. We would point it at the moon, and he would say, okay, that those waves that you're creating with your flashlight will hit the moon and bounce back to Earth.
Oh, wow.
And I thought that was phenomenal. Those waves have certain parameters. So in the cockpit with hearing, some of those commands have to be at a certain pitch to lift over, carry over engine noises. And maybe it's because of the way we're wired.
Right.
If, for example, if you're going to see a monster movie, a scary movie, and there'll be a point where the structure of the film, all of a sudden, boom, everyone screams. I have a feeling a scream is at a certain frequency that will always get a human being's attention because of our physiognomy. So hitting certain pitch points, that surprised me about it.
Now, did the engineers request those pitch points?
Yes, the engineers requested those pitch points in directing me. I would also have to ask what some of these phrases meant. Then there's a certain moment of gravitas there where you realize, okay, that means this, and it's an emergency, it's a critical situation, so keep your wits about you, but do it now. You don't have that kind of gravity, I guess, unless you're a brain surgeon, certainly not as an actor, that you simply have to get it right, do it right the first time. There may not be a second time.
You talked about the secrecy of the project. Do you know how or when your voice became known as Bitchin' Betty?
During the first test of digitizing my voice and seeing if the commands would work, you had the project engineer running out on the tarmac as the test pilot was there. And engineers, I love engineers because they figure out practical solutions to every problem. My vision of an aerospace engineer, they always have pocket protectors. I love that because if you think of the manned factors, and several of my family were involved with manned factors for the Apollo flights and the Gemini flights way early on, you can hear husband-wife scenario. Wife, honey, you've got ink all over your shirt pocket again. How many times have I told you I can't get these stains out? What, do you think we're made out of money? I have to buy you new shirts all the time. And after about the 10th time husband hears this, he says, well, what if and he'll do it on a cocktail napkin or any little piece of paper. Okay, let me see if I can do a pocket protector that I can slide in my pocket, so when I put my pens in there, they're not going to ruin my shirts. There is that kind of aspect of, how do we make this work physically? That's in every bit of engineering. That's why I love engineers. Getting back to the first test flight and the birth of Bitchin' Betty. So the project engineer runs out on the tarmac and says, what do you think? What do you think? It turns out that when the first chip was digitized, there was a malfunction in the imprint. And so there was a slight burble, and there was also a command that kept repeating and repeating and repeating. It did not sync up with Command A should sound like this, press A button. It would be Command B over and over and over. Engineer once again rolls out and said, what do you think? What do you think? And the test pilot said, oh, it's sweet, but that Bitchin' Betty. Now, I always thought it was Bitchin' Betty. Don't forget, back then it was like Beach Boys surfing, and bitchin' was way cool. It took me literally 20, 30 years until I see it spelled out in like Wikipedia or something like Bitching Betty. And it's like, no. Yeah, there is the over and over part of it, but it was like pilots loved Betty. They loved Betty. The first time they tried to use a different voice, the pilots voted them all down. So that's not Betty.
Oh, wow.
And for a long time, and I don't know if that's still true in this reincarnation of the aircraft, there were one or two commands that were my commands. It was a lower voice than one of the gals who came along in one of the aircraft. And that imprint, that double bloop bloop imprint on the early chip was kept because of the request of the pilots. It was kept because they said it sounded like Bitchin' Betty was crying, that it was a sob. catch in the throat.
Speaking of replacing Bitch and Betty, since there have been several replacements over the years, what are some of the things that separate you and the other pioneers from the new Bettys?
A lot of the new baby gals doing this safe or runway system safety, we old dogs have the gravitas. Some of the younger gals, for my taste, are a bit flip, a bit casual, and that may have something to do with the constant upward inflection that is prevalent in our conversational English today. In fact, it's called upspeak, where the inflection at the end of a sentence goes up instead of down, which makes everything kind of sound like a question rather than a statement. And it also sounds casual, like you don't know what you're saying or meaning, which might be fine for everyday conversation vernacular, but it makes no sense to my ears, my opinion only, in critical implementation stages of flight.
So we have the name Bitch and Betty or Bitching Betty, depending on which version you like. If you could nickname the voice of the aircraft, what would you have called it?
If I could nickname the voice of the aircraft, I would nickname it Bitchin' Betty. I would probably spell it Bitchen.
Oh.
But no, it's such a fabulous name. Someone told me at one point there was someone kind of in World War II who had that name. But it does have a resonance of the names that go before of these, the feminine element communicators. Of course, on the negative side, for us, you had Tokyo Rose.
Right.
There's something in our mythos, in our myth, our collective country's mythos, that Bitch and Betty is wonderful.
Because you're